Hi again. Let's do take a quick look at the leukocytes, the white blood cells. So this first slide on leukocytes, it's a little busy, but don't panic. Well, you don't need to memorize everything on this slide. What I would like you to pay attention to are the cell types. So we will be looking at and discussing these, some more than others. And then for each of those cell types, pay attention to the primary functions that we'll discuss briefly as we go through those. So let's just go through them in order. Basophils, as we'll see in a moment, I'm going to just introduce these cells in this slide, and then the remaining slides in this short lecture will be to look at each one of these types in more detail. But basophils are essentially mast cells. They're basically the same depending on where you find them. If they're circulating in the blood, we call them a basophil. If they're out in the tissues, we call them a mast cell, because many white blood cells can migrate in and out of the blood system. So they go into the tissues and then they go back into the blood. They climb out of the blood vessels and climb back into the blood vessels. That's just part of their normal surveillance duties. So the thing to note with basophils and mast cells is that they release histamine. I'm going to keep coming back to histamine. And histamine is involved with inflammation that we saw previously. Remember that it dilated blood vessels, and it's involved with allergic responses that we'll see also. Neutrophils, as we go through this, they are strongly phagocytic, so they ingest and destroy. Eosinophils, we won't do much with those. They're quite rare in the blood. Their numbers seem to become elevated with certain parasitic infections. And then the monocytes, again, are related to macrophages. When they are circulating, when these cells are circulating in the blood, we call them monocytes. And when they go out into the tissues, we refer to them as macrophages. And again, we'll go through each of these in a little more detail next. And macrophages are involved with this idea of antigen presentation, which is the lecture after this one. Then we have the lymphocytes, and again, lymphocytes are related to plasma cells. We'll spend some time talking about plasma cells and antibody production. So those are lymphocytes. And we also have dendritic cells that are off in the skin, epithelial membranes, and they are involved with antigen presentation also. So there's a quick overview of where we're headed. So let's start with the neutrophils. Let me back up a moment. I want to point something out. So we have 5 types of leukocytes. And I'm going to give you a little mnemonic, a little memory device for remembering the leukocytes. There are 5 major classes, and I'll just list them from most common to least common. And then I'll give you the mnemonic for remembering them. See if I can get this out of here for a moment. So most common are the neutrophils. And then are the lymphocytes. be careful that you don't confuse lymphocyte with leukocyte. All of these are white blood cells. They are all leukocytes. One type of leukocyte are the lymphocytes associated with the lymph system. Then the monocytes. And then the eosinophils. And lastly, the basophils. And that's the order to the least common. If you took a sample of blood and you looked at it under a microscope, so in this order. And the mnemonic for remembering that, if we write that on the other side, never let monkeys eat bananas. Never let monkeys eat bananas. And again, from most common to least common. So the N for neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils, if that helps. Okay, back to the previous slide. So, going through these in order, start with the neutrophils. They are strongly phagocytic. And they are easily recognized under a microscope due to the shape of their nucleus. It has 3 to 5 segments or lobes, and there's lots of different shapes. So the figures on the right show neutrophils, and the dark staining material is the nucleus. And I like to say that it sort of looks like badly formed sausage. Multiple lobes, high degree of variability, which gives rise to different names that people have given neutrophils. So I'd like you to be familiar with some of these different names. Polymorphonuclear leukocytes, that's a mouthful, so a lot of people abbreviate those as PMNs. Poly means many, morph is referring to shape, and nucleus is pretty obvious. So many shapes of the nucleus. And sometimes people have abbreviated that to just straight polys. And some people I've read and heard describe neutrophils as segs. So it's basically jargon. If you recognize those as synonyms for neutrophils, you're good. I can't play, or haven't figured out how to play these videos during this lecture, but the links should be hot in the PowerPoint. If you download that, you should be able to play these links from your browser. If I remember right, one of them is introductory, and the other one is kind of a neat picture of a neutrophil chasing some bacteria, and it finally eats them. So it's kind of for fun. Take a look at those links if you get a chance. Next slide are the lymphocytes, and these are part of the specific or acquired immunity. This is what you develop when you develop resistance to a particular disease. It involves the lymphocytes. They're fairly easy to recognize. The nucleus fills up most of the cytoplasm. So again, the dark staining is the nucleus. There's very little cytoplasm that's left. The two types of lymphocytes that we'll talk about are the B cells and the T cells. So let's do the B cells first. When B cells, they become activated in response to a specific pathogen, such as a virus. B cells become activated. They then develop into plasma cells, which we'll go through later. And the plasma cells produce and release antibodies. So antibodies circulating in the blood are produced by activated B cells or plasma cells. T cells develop and they finish their maturation in the thymus, as I mentioned earlier with the lymphatic system. And there are two flavors, broad flavors, if you will, of T cells. There are helper T cells and there are cytotoxic T cells. The helper T cells, again, go by different abbreviations that you probably should recognize. T for T cell, and H for helper, so T sub H. They're identified by proteins on the surface, and one of those proteins is called CD4, which sometimes is abbreviated to T4. So these are T cells with that particular antigen on the surface. And the helper T cells activate other cells of the immune system. They get them revved up and going. So they activate other B cells and also the T cells. Well, they activate all cells of all lymphocytes involved in a specific immune reaction. So the cytotoxic T cells similarly are designated by a T sub C or the T8, which comes from a different protein on their surface, which is a CD8. So they're sometimes abbreviated as T8 cells. It's fine with me to call them T cells or cytotoxic T cells. And what's noteworthy is that these are the cells of your immune system that their job is to kill your own cells when they become infected with a virus. The virus is living inside your cells and you need to kill those cells and kill the virus. That's the job of the cytotoxic T cells. I would be careful calling these killer T cells. I tend to stay away from that term, killer T cells, because that's not the same thing as a different type of cell, which is referred to as a natural killer cell. They both have killer in the name. They do kill other cells, but they're not the same type of cell. Natural killer cells work in a non-specific manner. Where this type of T cell, these cytotoxic T cells, are very specific. They're part of the specific immune response, targeting a specific and particular pathogen. So those are the lymphocytes. The monocytes, when they're immature, they are circulating in the blood, and then they leave the blood, they leave the circulation, and then they enter the tissues, at which point they're referred to as macrophages. And they are very phagocytic. They will eat lots of bacteria. They also function as antigen-presenting cells, which is the next lecture. So this slide that I pulled out of a Nature Review article is not something for you to memorize, but maybe just to look at and see what you do recognize in the slide and not worry too much about what you don't. Well, here's the bone marrow, and here is a stem cell. Okay. Develops in the bone marrow and releases the monocytes. They have a sort of a horseshoe-shaped nucleus. They're out in the blood, as we mentioned. They're circulating. And then they can leave the blood and enter the tissue spaces. And when they do enter the tissue spaces, they can develop into other types of cells. So they're both macrophages. And something to note is that some of these macrophages then go on and develop into other types of cells. So in particular are the osteoclasts that we looked at last quarter with bone turnover. And you know that osteoclasts break down bone tissue. I thought that was interesting. You could just sort of follow and note, oh, osteoclasts are actually derived from a macrophage, a leukocyte. Okay, enough of that. If you want to view that, I don't know if I gave you the link to that or not. Apparently I didn't, so don't worry about the link. Eosinophils are granular. They have little tiny grains in them that if one stained properly, you can see underneath the microscope. That's not a big deal for this class. They're normally fairly rare, circulating, and as I mentioned before, their numbers can become elevated with fighting certain parasitic diseases such as worms. So we don't see a lot of parasitic worm infections in this country, but in other countries that don't have as decent health care and clean water, parasitic worm infections are quite common. And basophils, which is our last type of leukocyte, the most rare, they also are granulocytes. They have little granules in them, which I'm not going to spend much time talking about. And they're normally quite rare in the blood. And when they enter the tissues, they are referred to as mast cells. So the figure on the right, here's a basophil circulating in the blood. Let me see if I can move this out of the way. So here is a basophil circulating in the blood, and this picture at the bottom right is difficult to see, but it's a slide of tissues, and there is a mast cell with little granules out in the tissues. What you need to remember is that both basophils and mast cells release histamine. And the histamine mediates or controls inflammatory reactions and allergic reactions. The most significant of these is anaphylaxis, which can lead to shock, anaphylactic shock, which we'll talk about later. Okay, you do not need to identify those. So I believe that was it for an introduction to the leukocyte.